All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of IGSA's 18th annual conference. We are very happy that you're here with us today on our second day. And just to recap what we covered on the first day, we heard presentations from 3 graduate students on the topic of identity formations and information. We had 3 students present various forms of art in a wonderful artist panel, and we had the pleasure of hearing a lecture from Dr. Zarina Grewal on Reading Muslims, Race, Islam, and U.S. Empire. Today, we will be hearing from 2 other graduate student panels. The first is on social conflict and resistance, and the second will be on histories of racialization. There will also be a brief break in between the panels. So before we get started with today, I just wanted to share a couple of reminders with everyone. The first is that this panel is being recorded and will be put up later on the Duke-UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies YouTube channel. And the second is, if you have any questions for the panelists throughout the day, please put them in the Q&A box and we will read them to the panelists. All right, let's get started with our first panel. Today we'll be hearing from 2 graduate students on the theme of social conflict and resistance. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Mohammed Abdu, had to drop out this morning because of a family emergency. So we will start with our first speaker, Meena Naik, who is a doctoral candidate in the University of North Texas's Department of Educational Psychology. Meena will be presenting on a paper entitled Implications of Racialization, Identity Conflict, Muslim American Epistemologies, and Agency. All right, take it away, Meena.
Awesome, thank you so much. First, I just want to share my thanks and gratitude for this opportunity to present and share, and also to do my best. I am in Texas. It's been a little bit of a rough week, but I didn't want to miss this opportunity. And so, here we are. And I'm excited to see your thoughts on what I've attempted to put together as a really strong, I hope, approach and theoretical understanding of what some identity conflict looks like, and bringing together different borrowed theories from a variety of places to kind of tell this story. And ultimately what this leads me down to is, how do things like identity conflict, navigating this notion of, can you really be a Muslim in America, an American Muslim with the hyphen? Is it always going to be an other outsider role? And how to negotiate and protect yourself in that other outsider role, ultimately leading to, what does agency look like? And I've applied this to a specific segment and population, which I'll share a little bit more about as we move into this. So ultimately, this entire presentation is built on the idea of moving away from, and I shouldn't say moving away from as the only option, but a lot of work that I've seen, particularly because I come from the background of education, is that concepts like religious identity formation often fall under the theological framing. How does one build in and get socialized to a religious framework? How does it build a belief system, and so on? What that seems to negate often is the reality that there's also a cultural and lived aspect when it comes to this identity formation. And we've seen this come out in recent years. One of the works I can remember most recently is, Sylvia Chan Mullick's Being Muslim, or even a couple of the other sources that I'll mention as we go through this presentation, where it starts to recognize that there is a social, cultural, secular dimension. There's this lived aspect. Well, when you look at this lived aspect, it's no longer just a religious identity, and we start to walk into this gray area where some of these other things start to come up. And so this paper, and what I attempted to cover, is trying to take a look at how racialization develops and promotes an essentialized understanding, which then creates an epistemic injustice, an epistemic distortion of understanding. That if I am always understood as this stereotyped other, then how do I actually navigate my own individual identity, practice my agency, resist that essentialized other, and so on? Because ultimately there is this unique experience that I have that results from a non-essentialized experience through interactions in the social sphere, the cultural spheres, the public spheres, and so on. And then in a special population that has been heavily essentialized into this Muslim stereotype as understood in the West, this idea of the brown terrorist, Muslim other, the clothing and identity markers, and so on. Well, if we divorce that because we're trying to resist this essentialized notion, and we start looking specifically at the South Asian experience, as distinctly separate from the Muslim experience and then together with the Muslim experience, how do we navigate things like the model minority myth, having to be the accepted but valued immigrant, but still being the perpetual other versus the more evil, terrorist, understood other that is the Muslim American. And so this comes from that, and I will also preface a lot of my work comes from my own lived experiences and things that I've had to sort of make sense of, and that insider-outsider sort of notion will come out as I continue through this presentation. So really setting the case for all of this, when we talk about the case for racialization, there's a lot of work that has it well established. If we look at, for example, Seher Salod's work or Junaid Rana's work, they've really laid the foundation for what has happened as Islam has become a racialized identity as opposed to a faith identity. When we carry this forward, though, and actually kind of unpack what this implies, what we can look to now are racial theories and development theories in critical race theory. And so one of the ones that I pulled in on with this paper is this idea of the racial formation theory. When Omi and Meena talk about it, what they really bring in is this idea that race is a way of making up people. It is controlled through a dominant narrative. It's developed through histories and social constructs, all things that are not entirely shocking when we think about the ways that Muslims have been made up, not just post 9/11, which represents sort of a major turning point, but also pre 9/11. If we look at Cold War politics, if we look at the ways in which Black American Islam was laid out against the more orthodox Islam that was seen in the Arab West around that time as better than, and then eventually became the orthodox worse than, the terrorist group, it starts to make sense that this formation theory, although in Omi and Winant's work focuses on phenotypic characteristics, right? What our body carries still applies to something if we're really talking about making people up. And so what we've seen through time is this historical construction of making people up. We can look at the ways in which Pan-Asian groups have been put together as the Oriental other. And now this is drawing in on Said's work. We can look at the ways in which this has then led to sort of this exoticism and this fanaticism, even the understanding of the Muslim as the evil, barbaric, particularly the male terrorist other, the one that has to be controlled and stopped, while the Muslim woman other is understood as subjugated, oppressed, and not having any sort of authority in their own lives, which creates now a cultural conflict. And so again, bringing in this idea of that formation theory and how it carries together, but recognizing that it really does expand beyond just this sort of embodied experience because it comes into this conflict between those cultural and social forces. Can you be American if you carry markers that suggest you are quote unquote backwards? And those markers have been identified as cultural markers, the hijab, for example, the Muslim beard, and things like that, that when we hear those terms, we know exactly what they refer to, but they also don't reflect the actual nuance and individualized experience. Taking all of this together, we start to run into this idea of the culture race, that is there a race that's actually developed around a culture? And when that starts to happen, what we start to see is this essentialized experience, because now we are conflating what was otherwise lived experiences, cultural identity markers, clothing identity, my body, my color, my creed, my religion, my nationality, and we're building it all into this very simplistic good Muslim or bad Muslim or terrorist Muslim other. And when this essentialized race starts to come together, what it does is it erases those cultural differences. So what otherwise might have been understood and previously was understood as different groups, if we look back into history in the late 1800s and 1900s with some of the legal action that came out, be it the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Immigration Act, naturalization laws, the idea that Arab Americans could be considered as white if they chose to be on the census, whether or not they do is a completely different story. We start to see that all of this is really malleable. It builds over time. And what it does is it supports racial stratification. And this racial stratification and hierarchy is not something that's new. We can look pre-colonial times and think about things like the caste system and other hierarchies that existed. But if we look at the colonial times as a turning point, building upon Junaid Rana's work, what we start to see is that it actually starts to develop as a construct for control. It develops as a social, malleable construct that is controlled by a larger, broader hegemonic voice. It leads to this construction of whiteness that then puts everyone else beneath that hierarchy. This isn't necessarily new information, but what starts to kind of float up is, well, where do Muslims fall in this hierarchy if it is a racialized notion? And within that, if we actually break apart the different groups and individual experiences that are in there, how do they actually start to stratify? That tension starts to create this conflict that actually leads us to what we can look at as a paradox of identity. So this is directly from Said's work, where what he points to is how Orientalism can be understood as a place to look for this demonstration where we lose this identity, where we start to lose this understanding, we start to see this consolidation and conflation. And when that happens, this overarching narrative, this narrative of the sort of European West that sort of took over as colonization spread. And if we look back to history, we see that happen. We see how other structures were started to, were broken apart. The caste system being one of them. It was broken apart, built back together around religious divides, around things like the darkness of your skin color. If we look at the time of the slave trade, we see that, for example, the Moors and any Black slaves who also were Muslim were considered the more wanted, as opposed to those slaves who were not. So there starts to be this stratification and hierarchy that then extends when we look at how immigration and things like that have changed in recent present. And so if we look at this narrative of a culturally essentialized Islam, and we see this translation to this racialized construct, we see how it goes from things like the Spanish Reconquista and the expulsion of the Moors into the slave trade, into the destruction of other archetypes and hierarchies to build this racially driven one. We start to see how this transmission and translation across time through what could be understood as social identities, cultural spheres, legal policies, all of those constructs actually then impose an identity framework onto someone. It imposes upon an entire community of people how they should be, how they're understood, how they're viewed by the world. And it actually then leads them to have to decide how much they want to buy into that or not. We look at the United States, things like assimilation, acculturation, what it takes to be considered no longer immigrant in this country, and if that is actually something that's attainable. Those are all examples of how this imposition starts to create what can then be understood as essentialized powers in communities that differentiate, create continued stratification, and then collapse all of these groups together when it's convenient. So if we, and within the US politics, the war on terror, the Muslim ban, it was convenient to collapse all of these identities upon themselves to be able to control the narrative in the group. Meanwhile, if we look previously, it wasn't something that was actually collapsed in on itself. If we look at back to the Cold War era, and if we look at how Islam was understood at that time, where the Nation of Islam was considered the agitating group, the violent group, it wasn't collapsed at that time. And these are all examples of how this is malleable and formed, but also how in that there's a loss of agency to the knower and the beer that is the one that is being Muslim in this community of being Muslim. This creates what can be seen as epistemic distortions. And what this does, if we look at the broader sense and power, it leads to the outside group becoming blind. And if I read this directly, we become blind to the specificity of human life when we totalize cultures, erase their histories, and exoticize their ways of life. Well, Orientalism is a good example of how that exoticism has actually occurred. The erasure of history is not something that's new, particularly as we start to consolidate these groups and narratives into each other, which leads to that totalization. And as that happens, individuals actually lose that agency, that identity, and we start to see this sort of downfall of understanding. What does it mean to be Muslim? What does it mean to be a Muslim in America? How do we actually negotiate, navigate that? If we think about things like the Patriot Act and Salod's work, what she actually found was that not only was there a gender difference in being impacted by what could be understood as anti-Muslim racism, what can also be understood as Islamophobia, depending on how you want to coin that term. What she found was that it also led to internal conflict. as groups were trying to maintain vigilance on each other. Patriot Act, it encouraged state-sanctioned internal surveillance of yourself and your own community to show that you were actually more American, more patriotic, and willing to claim that by shedding an entire identity of yourself or engaging in this conflict. That conflict is where we start to see what the South Asian Muslim experience can look like. So one of the things that if we accept this idea of racialization, we carry it forward, and if we start to see that there is actually merit to thinking about it this way, we can then take Kim's theory of racial triangulation and what she came up with through her work by looking at the way that race is made up, by looking at the historical, social, political theories and laws that actually came together, including things, we're right around the anniversary of the act that led to Japanese internment in the United States. All of these are examples of how Asian Americans, a pan-ethnic identity that totalized an entire culture, created a valorization framework. Along this line, you have Orientalism, right? Am I the other or am I an insider? Am I accepted as a foreigner or as someone who belongs in the United States? Within that particular axis, you have Black Americans, for example. In this triangulation, Black Americans are considered insiders while Asian Americans are considered the foreign other. Meanwhile, at the top, there's another axis of the valorized whiteness. There is a hierarchy, white being the ideal, being the one that is superior, being the one that is dominant power of control. And at that particular axis, the Black community is at the bottom and the Asian Americans are in the middle. This is where things like the myth of the model minority start to form. Because within that, if they are the accepting immigrant, if they are the one that's valued, if they contribute to society, they keep their heads down, they stay quiet, which is how South Asian groups are understood to behave, then they are valorizing the white ideal. They're doing what they want. They're also being complicit in othering of another. They're being complicit in the oppression of another group. When we look at the insider status, however, nothing that they do, because they are always considered the foreign other, they will never actually be brought into this idea of being the full Muslim, in this case, Muslim American, but in Kim's theory, Asian American. They will never be just American. It will always be Asian American or an Asian in America. Well, we can apply this to the South Asian experience because this is precisely what happened. Prashad represents this work really well in pointing out that even the immigration stories, the movements of diasporas, how and when they occurred, might actually create their own identity groups. And that's not something that's understood because, again, this culture is totalized into a single movement, into a single immigrant community by the power that holds all of the constructions of race. If we bring into that then, what I bring in from this world of educational psychology and human development, there's this notion that we are socialized into our worlds. We're brought up and experience a specific life course trajectory. And there are certain milestones. Within that, there's also cohort effects. So there are entire times, if we take Prashad's approach, that the diaspora, depending on what movement is being considered, could be their own cohort because the time, context, space they came into, the tensions of that time and what they had to deal with in those moments represent what can be understood as their own unique epistemology, their own unique distortion, their own unique erasure. If we think about today's college students, nearly 2 decades after 9/11, this entire generation of all Muslim Americans, all Muslim immigrants, all Muslims in America, if they were born after 2001, represents their own cohort. They have a unique context to which they were socialized. They don't know a time that existed before the War on Terror, the Patriot Act. Islamophobia is a coined term as opposed to what we saw a little bit more implicitly prior to that. And that leads to what is seen here as Haro's cycle of socialization, which is that as you're born into this, as you're born into that cohort, you're socialized by your family, by the media, by what is considered safe and not, using Salod's example of internal surveillance, that if I surveil internally, maybe this is allowing me to actually reclaim my own identity a little bit, claim that I do belong in America, claim that I represent the patriotic America, so be it, if that also means that I'm going against my own community in another space. That interaction and negotiation is where this conflict starts to come out. So within that cycle of socialization, this entire cohort has been brought up during a time where there's been escalating anti-Muslim sentiment, where we've seen an ongoing escalation of the war on terror, most recently the Muslim ban. Yes, it's been repealed, but there's a whole other load of unpacking that has to come with that. And then as we carry that forward, we start to see also the reality that this cohort has now hit a life course milestone. They are most likely to be in college, and that college in the world of educational theory is a place for socialization. It's a place to let go of certain understandings and beliefs, to be questioned, and to engage in this sort of democratic ideal of negotiating, being a citizen, understanding what that means, engaging in identity conflict, practicing agency. And so if we look specifically at the South Asian Muslim experience, what we actually start to see is, one, they've got the triangulation. Are they the model minority? Are they the welcome immigrant? Do they get what they need by being here? We also see on the other side, are they going to claim their Muslim identity? If it's not already visible. If it is visible, how do they leverage the two? How do they carry these two forward? This is a purely theoretical application of this entire work, but the idea would be that this construct actually emphasizes the role that racialization plays and opens another door for us through which we can actually understand the phenomena of how and why certain groups experience being Muslim differently and engage in this ongoing epistemic understanding and the cultural epistemology that forms as a result of who they are, what their body embodies, the way that they actually carry these movements forward, the way that society actually pulls this into things. This transformation of cultures through these movements is actually where we see the actions taken upon a group. And this is where that racialization, that making up of people starts to come in. And as we go through all of this, what we start to see is how this valorization framework might actually explain how and why and when the youth that are in college today, this post 9/11 generation, actually engages with, and not post 9/11 as in those who have experienced 9/11, but this truly post 9/11 generation engages with, traces their own history, understands their identity, both within their community, the in-group, out-group, outside other, insider status, and goes through that ongoing conflict, and ultimately leads to what the resistance could look like. If we think back to Medina's framework, that do we resist by reducing the totalization of cultures? Do we resist by engaging in understanding the sort of non-essentialized communities? And do we resist by reclaiming the histories that have since been erased? If we carry this forward, if this research is carried forward through additional studies and cohort understandings, what's missing at this point is what the impact of college actually looks like and how that plays into and might promote this identity resistance and conflict, how it promotes understanding and working through this tension through things like reflective judgment, self-authorship, student development. And it also would benefit from looking more closely at how cultural heritage, conditions of the diaspora, those erased histories actually play into the way that people are brought up in their family systems, in their social systems, and build into what Haro put out as the cycle of socialization. Thank you for your time. I hope that I was able to share a good chunk of this work, and I apologize if any of it was choppy, but here we are.
Thank you so much, Meena. That was great. So our last presentation in this panel will be by Nisa Mohammed, who is an African Studies PhD student at Howard University. Nisa will be presenting her paper titled, "Why are Black Muslim Students Leaving the Muslim Students Association?" Please go ahead, Nisa.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. I first of all want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my paper. And I want to give a special thanks to my husband, Abdul Jalil Muhammad, for your love and guidance in just kind of everything that I do. So first of all, I want to read you a quote from a Muslim Student Association petition that students at a large East Coast, predominantly white institution received from a group of disgruntled students recently. In fact, really about a year ago, students sent this petition to their e-board, executive board. So to the Muslim Students Association, one ummah, apolitical, only a religious organization. These are some of the many excuses our MSA, Muslim Students Association, and more broadly, many of our Muslim American communities have used time and time again to stifle the voices of the marginalized. Our communities reek of anti-Blackness and unapologetic support of heteropatriarchy. Why do we constantly see claims of the blessed history of the life of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but both a passive and active refusal to follow in his role as a radical activist fighting for justice? Our own Muslim Students Association at this university reflects and further perpetuates the issues of many of our larger Muslim American communities, and we are tired of it. So this petition was sent to the e-board because the Black Muslim students and other students had just been fed up of their experience in the Muslim Students Association. So there is a growing phenomena happening all across the country of Black Muslim students leaving the MSA. And so what's happening is that my paper examines why are Black Muslim students leaving the MSA? And so around the country, we see at New York University, the Black Muslim students left the MSA and they started what they call the Black Muslim Initiative. At Columbia University, the Black Muslim students left and started an organization called MANSA, which stands for Muslim Afro-Nia Students Association. At the University of Pennsylvania, the Black Muslim students left. And in fact, I think they may have been, in fact, the first one. They started an organization called Pensapolo, which is dedicated to fostering dialogue, creating community, and engaging in service around the Black Muslim experience. So what's happening with Black Muslim students is not a unique phenomena. Being Black on a white campus has been challenging and fraught with anti-Blackness since Black students began to be on white campuses in 1957, when 9 Black students called the Little Rock Nine were escorted onto a white school back in 1957, as I said, and they had to be escorted with the National Guard. So it's always been a challenge being Black on a white campus. The problem is now that it's race and religion, and that's what the challenge is now for Black Muslim students. And so what they're finding is now they're faced with challenges such as this. They go to an MSA meeting or MSA events and everything, the themes are always South Asian and Arab themes. So they can be at a campus for 4 years and never hear from a Black scholar. They can be on campus for 4 years and never hear from a Black imam. They go to a social event and they walk into the social event and all of a sudden the other Muslim students start speaking in a foreign language. They go to an event and the food is always either South Asian or Arab, and they want to get involved in a social justice issue. Let's say, for example, they want the social justice issue to be centered around police brutality, and they're told that is not Islamic. And they're told, well, our MSA only deals with issues around Syria or Palestine. Here's another example. So the University of Michigan was raising money to send water to Pakistan, a very noble effort. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But does anybody see anything wrong with that? University of Michigan in Detroit raising money to send water to Pakistan. Absolutely a very noble effort, but 30 minutes right down the road is Flint, Michigan, which had a major water problem. A major water problem where the Black people had to leave their homes to get water to bathe in, to cook with, to wash their clothes, to brush their teeth. And the Muslim students on that campus saw no need to raise money to do anything for the Black people 30 miles away. And so how do you think the Black Muslim students felt that the Muslims had love in their heart for the other Muslims around the world, but no love in their heart for the Black people 30 miles away? So these are the issues that the Black Muslim students see happening right in their own MSA, and they say, we are tired of it. And so the Black Muslim students feel marginalized. They feel a frustration. They feel like this dean, this expression of the faith that they love, has no love for them. And so they decide to leave, and they decide to say enough is enough. And so looking back at the history of why, in fact, the Muslim Student Association was even created. It was created in 1963 by international students at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, who wanted to have an organization to meet the needs of Muslim students that were immigrating to America. And not only immigrating to America, but from specific countries. Students that were immigrating from Arab and South Asian countries, not Black Muslim students that were immigrating from Africa, specifically students that were immigrating from South Asian and Arab countries. And so they immigrated, they were specifically creating this organization to help those students. And so they created the Muslim Students Association. And to this day, they have created this organization that has spread all across the country. They created leadership positions. The MSA has grown and it has flourished and continue to this day have issues and challenges incorporating Black Muslim students in their organizations. So I spoke to a student just on Friday who is trying to get involved with her MSA on her campus. And she said the response she has gotten from the students on her campus is, why are you trying to force yourself upon us? She's very hurt. She's in tears, like, what am I supposed to do? You know, I'm one of very few Muslim students on my, Black Muslim students on my campus, and I'm trying to get involved with the MSA, and that's the response she's getting. So these are some of the reasons why Black Muslim students are leaving. But this is why, this is also a historical thing, because these are the reasons why Black student organizations, Black student unions formed in the 60s and 70s as a result to the anti-Blackness they experienced on campuses, on predominantly white campuses then. And so they started Black student unions as a safe haven for them to express themselves, for them to have their own cultural events, for them to have their own organizations to express their and experience their own leadership positions, their own mentoring, to escape the anti-Blackness they experienced that were just about race. So Black Muslim students sometimes leave the MSA, they join the Black Student Union where they can express their racial identity, but religion is not involved. So Black Muslim students are at the intersection of race and religion so that they can have be a safe haven for what it is they want to do. Now, why do they stay? So for a lot of Black Muslim students on some campuses, they are able to thrive. So it's not all a bad experience, as we have found on some campuses, my research was able to determine, it's not all a bad experience. But for some, they are able to have a very good experience. Now, not that racism does not exist. For a lot of them, the racism still exists. For example, at Princeton, they have the same racist experience. A Princeton student in a class of 21 wrote, my freshman year, when she met her freshman roommate, the roommate demanded a change just because she found out her roommate was Black. The roommate said, oh, my roommate is Black, I need a change because I can't have a Black roommate. A Dartmouth student said they went to a frat party and the Black students were told, oh, go around back and go through the dog door. That's where my Black friends are coming in, while the white friends were coming in through the front door. These are racist experiences that are going on still today. So the racism is still existing on campuses right until today. So the racism exists today, but what is the factor that changes for Black Muslim students who find an ability to thrive on a campus with their MSA? The key difference is that they are anchored by a Black masjid, a Black mosque that is in the neighborhood of their campus. And so what happens is that when they have that anchor, when they have that resource of a Black masjid that is connected with that MSA, they have that resource so that there is a Black imam, they have a foundational support, they have opportunities to help them be successful outside of just looking at that MSA, because that MSA, they're not going to act up and be anti-Black knowing that there is a Black masjid right there. So that Black masjid, the imam of that Black masjid is overlooking what is happening in that MSA. That imam is going to be there doing Juma often at that MSA. That Black imam is there to provide guidance and support to the MSA. There's also a chaplain at the MSA who knows and is sensitive to anti-Blackness. that chaplain at that university integrates immediately what is going on and is sensitive to the issues of all the students, is looking for the outlier, who is missing, who is not getting involved. Now, the other school also had a Muslim chaplain and was also integral in helping the Black Muslim students to leave the MSA. So I don't want to minimize the effect of what a Muslim chaplain is able to do. That the other school, the Muslim chaplain was effective in helping the Black Muslim students to leave. When the Black Muslim students at the other school expressed their concerns about, the racism, the anti-Muslim experiences they were having, the Muslim chaplain was trying to negotiate the situation. And when the negotiations failed, they said, okay, if you all want to leave, I can help you leave. And so the Muslim chaplain had for years realized the anti-Blackness that was potentially a big problem to happen and nipped it in the bud from the very beginning. Because having a Black masjid near the campus was so very helpful, because not only did they have a Black masjid near the campus, but also had a Black church near the campus, so that campus had so many connections with the Black community that there was no way that the MSA nor any other Black organization on campus was going to be able to have anti-Blackness in anything that they did, because not only were the Black Christians involved, the Black Muslims were involved, so that there was a Black interfaith congregational support for all the Black students on that campus. So the racism or the anti-Blackness on that campus was minimized for not only the Black Muslims, but for all the Black students, because there was a significant amount of support for the Black students on that campus from the Black community. And that was significantly helpful for especially the Black Muslims, because being Black is one thing because you're a minority, but being a Black Muslim, you're doubly a minority, because you're marginalized. And so for the Black Muslims to have a Black masjid, so that if anything happened, those Black Muslims could go right near to that masjid and say, look, this is what's going on our campus. We need your help. And that masjid was looking at, they're like, what do you need? We got you. You need somebody to come for iftar. You need help. You need food, whatever it was, because those people at that masjid saw those Black Muslim students as their children. Not only due to just some students at a university, no, you belong to us. And anything that you need, anything going on, do you need food? Do you need clothing? Do you need whatever it is? You need money for books? Do you need housing? Whatever, you belong to us. For as long as you're on this campus or whatever, you belong to us. And so it was not, the children to me said, and that Black masjid was coming to their aid. And so that was the greatest support and the greatest difference. Whereas at the other university, those students felt alone. It was like they were in the wilderness and there was no one to help them. And so what they found out was that when they left the MSA, previously when they were involved in the MSA, they had about 5, maybe 10 at the most Black Muslims involved with the MSA. When they left that MSA and started their own organization, they had close to 40 Black Muslims involved in this new organization. They didn't even know there were that many Black Muslims on the campus. But as soon as they started their own organization and started having their own events and found a Black imam to come and do Juma for them, they found they had 40 Black Muslims on that campus. And they started having their own speakers and events that featured and spoke to the needs and concerns of Black Muslims. Black Muslims started coming out of the woodwork saying, here we are, speak to us because you are speaking to our needs. And they got rid of the South Asian and Arab hegemony in terms of their events. And it became for them an eye-opening experience, and it revolutionized and empowered them as Black Muslims to say, we can do something for ourselves and for our community. So here are some solutions. Here are some things that you can do that I included in my paper are some suggestions of what to do. So number one, look at the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What did he do? The student said that he's a radical example of social justice. Follow his example. His work was for the marginalized people. If you look around, who are the marginalized people today? And really Black Muslims are the outliers. On every campus, Black Muslims are the marginalized people. They are the ones who are trying to get in the mix of what is going on the campus, and they can't get in the mix. And that's why they leave. That's why they are leaving, trying to find out, doing their own thing, because they cannot find their way into what's going on. On some campuses, that in terms of me doing my research, Juma is in Arabic. And so that may be fine for what you're doing, but a lot of times the Black Muslims, their Arabic is not that sufficient or proficient where they can even understand what's going on. No, but there's not a translator there. They don't understand it. And so where is their spirituality going? How is it being fed? How are they being highlighted? How are they being taught? And it's like nobody even cares. It's like nobody even cares. But is that the Sunnah? Would Prophet Muhammad even be pleased with that? Would Allah be pleased with that? These people are coming to Juma and nobody even cares that they can even understand what the Khatib is saying, because representation matters. Representation matters. I'm here on this campus for 4 years and no Juma Khatib looks like me. No social event speaks to who I am as a Black Muslim. Nobody can do anything to represent who I am. I mean, so representation matters, and all of these things speak to who the students are as a Black Muslim student. And so think of that. Have events that speak to all the students. Food can be a microaggression. If the only food you serve is South Asian or Middle Eastern, and you think, well, this is Muslim food, that's just Muslim food for who you are. And if you say, well, we don't know what to serve, then have pizza. If you can't think of anything else to feed, that all young people tend to like pizza. Pizza can be a minimizer. It's a common ground. Young people tend to all like pizza, but don't use food as a weapon. I talked to young people, young Black Muslims, and they said, people ask us, well, what kind of food do you want? You want bean pie or something? Don't use food like that as a weapon against someone, that you want to just say something as a microaggression because you think you're going to hurt somebody or harm somebody by gallantly saying, what do you want, bean pie or something, as a weapon. The other thing is, don't try to do an undressing of Black Muslims by asking them a litany of questions. Are you in the nation? Are you in the imam's community? Do you know your prayers? Do you know the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Don't do that, because nobody asks you, are your parents Hindu? Are your grandparents Hindu? How long have you been Muslim? What is the lineage of your parents? Nobody does that to you. Nobody undresses you or your family. And you think you may be trying to help. I'm just trying to get to know people. Nobody does that to you. This kind of undressing, this kind of asking of a litany of questions is only done to Black Muslims. And the harm of it is that it's done to Black Muslims who clearly look African, who clearly have centuries of Muslims in their family. So these are microaggressions that Black Muslims have to endure. And the thing is, the sad thing about it is they submit themselves to these questions, and they submit themselves to these questions because they just want to fit in. They just want to be a part of the group. Stop doing that. It's wrong. It's wrong. And so this is why Black Muslims are leaving the MSA. They do not want to be a part of the anti-Blackness that they have to be subjected to. They want to be a part of the faith. They want to be a part of the deen. They don't want to be a part of the anti-Blackness. They don't want to be a part of the religious racism that continues to be a part of the faith that they love so much, but is not part of the deen of Islam. So I want to thank you again for this opportunity to present, and look forward to the exchange and the question and answer part and the discussion. Thank you again. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you so much, Nisa, for this really crucial presentation. We will now move to the discussant's comments on your papers. The discussant for this panel is Dr. Juliane Hammer, who is Associate Professor and the Keenan Rafai Scholar of Islamic Studies in the Religious Studies Department at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Hammer, please go ahead and say all of your comments to the panelists now. They will respond if they'd like to afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much. Just point of clarification, because you're gonna have to say it again. Professor Yusuf Carter is now the Keenan Rafai Scholar of Islamic Studies, for the record. Okay, so I wanna thank the organizers for putting this wonderful conference together under really difficult circumstances. Zoom conferences are not my favorite thing. I have over the past 10 months or so come to realize that what's missing there is the community aspect and the sort of interaction with each other, which was actually a hallmark of this grad student conference in all the years of its existence. I am, however, grateful that they invited me to come be a respondent to this particular panel. And I also want to thank Meena and Nisa for sharing their papers with me far enough in advance for me to actually read about them and sit with them. So the title of this panel is Social Conflict and Resistance. And while I see those as things that are happening in both of the papers, I also think that it's very clear from the presentations that we just heard that this is very much a panel about education. And more specifically with the two panelists about US college campuses and questions of race, racialization, and education. So I want to start by posing two questions, two related questions, two very big sort of meta level questions to both panelists, and then hope that they still remember them when I'm done with the more specific thoughts I have about their papers. So the first one is, and as I said, they're connected with each other. The first one is who or what is your critique addressed to? People, systems, society, communities, and individuals. I would like for you to reflect a little bit on that as a question. In my own work, I have spent a lot of time in the past decade thinking about what critique is, what analysis is, who we're critiquing, and why we're doing that. And so the second half of the question is, who is your prescription for, and how does that, or how might that relate to your field of study or your discipline, the discipline that you're working in? And considering how closely related the two presentations are, I would really love for the two of you, Meena and Nisa, to actually discuss your papers with each other a little bit. I think there's some really fruitful stuff that could potentially happen there. So coming specifically to Meena's presentation and paper, and I will admit here that this is one of the reasons why I asked this disciplinary question. So I'm clearly and obviously not in educational psychology, and I'm also not someone who advocates that we should all sort of align our theoretical frameworks so between disciplines. I think interdisciplinary research is a very complicated thing and a very complicated question in terms of resources, economic resources that support the various disciplines. I have lots of thoughts about the boundaries between different academic disciplines. So it's complicated in some ways for me to engage with you, Meena, in a way that obviously indicates that I come from a different field, right? So some of it is just a challenge that I think we face when we meet at conferences and in workshops of this kind. So I do want to suggest, because you focused so heavily on racialization and actually put it in opposition with faith identity, that's the term you used, that to me, in the work that I've been doing in the past decade, it's become clear that the relationship between race and religion is a lot more complicated. We saw yesterday in Professor Grewal's keynote lecture a genealogy of that I think was very helpful, and that it maps onto some of the concerns that I have even about the argument that, and that's not how she framed it. So Professor Grewal used the term anti-Muslim racism yesterday and explained why Islamophobia doesn't work. Others have argued that Islamophobia is racism. I tend to use anti-Muslim hostility, not racism, but represented as a form of racism that also leaves open the possibility that religion is in fact its own thing, and that religious hierarchies in the US context, but also in the Euro-American broader context, have a really long history. This is something that that Meena, you reflect on through Junaid Rana's work, but that Mohammed Abdu, the third panelist, originally was also supposed to talk about. So I want to just leave this sort of question there, and I would suggest that part of the problem is that or not the problem, but the sort of disconnect is that you draw primarily on scholars in ethnic and critical race studies. And as Professor Grewal also pointed out yesterday, those are people that typically have a really hard time talking about religion. They really simply don't know what to do with it. It is also true that people, especially in the field of American religions, have a really hard time talking about race unless they're studying African-American religions, right? So like the disconnect goes both ways. And I think something might be accomplished by trying to push a little bit more, at least in psychology and educational psychology, for incorporating religion as religion, so that we don't end up being very surprised that religion actually does matter to people, right? Because we often end up sort of in that place. I was also struck, and again, I think that has to do with the field of psychology and may also be something to potentially resist, by this focus on individuals and individual agency, while at the same time, the way you represent racialization is a process that's imposed on people. And all they can ever do is react and respond to it. You also talk about the sort of creation of communities that are imposed upon with these racialized identities. And so I want to know a little bit more about where you see resistance. Resistance is reactive, right? So it's based on a critique, but I think it would be interesting to think about the relationship between individuals and their identity formations that in your presentation are forced upon them for the most part. And then they individually, at least as college students, react to these impositions in a variety of ways. And I think the question that you're asking, which basically is, why would anyone impose a Muslim identity upon themselves when that's clearly not, there doesn't seem to be, from the perspective of theorists, there doesn't seem to be any benefit to that, which I think is where I'm circling around to say there might be something to a religious identity or religious belonging or religious communal structure that is a benefit, right? That in itself, being religious does something for people and is not only some type of sort of false consciousness imposition where people think that makes them feel better, which is how religion has typically been treated in that kind of context. And then lastly, perhaps I want to push back a little bit against this idea that 9/11 is a watershed moment. I'm channeling Dr. Grewal again. Her and I have made similar arguments over the past decade or so. And the reason is something that I think comes out really clearly in Nisa's paper, which is that when we work with watershed moments, the ones for US Muslims are usually 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, and then 9/11, we tend to overlook that there are pretty consistent longer histories, right? Like we cut off the possibility of those histories. That's not to say that 9/11 and 1965 didn't change certain things, but they also continued existing trends because US society didn't change so dramatically on 9/11 that we now sort of talk about the emergence of anti-Muslim hostility as opposed to 9/11 phenomenon. It's been there much longer than that. It's not been there forever, but it's been there for much longer. And if we sort of don't look at that, then I think we misunderstand sort of contemporary developments as well as really presentist concerns. And I would say that it is in fact the case that US Muslims and Muslims worldwide, perhaps in a sort of nod to Professor Jamil Aydin, who spoke yesterday as well, don't know enough of their history. Because if they did, they would see their present in slightly different ways. Okay, I'm gonna stay there. Okay, Nisa, thank you. I really appreciate the way you bring to life what is lived experience, including your clear frustration with what's happening. I'm not one to ever sort of advocate for detachment and so scholarly distance. So I just appreciate the sort of life that's in there. And the focus on resistance, not the conflicts themselves, but the resistance to those conflicts. And I was really struck in your paper and also now in your presentation by the fact that this resistance is clearly based on an analysis, a very clear analysis of individual and communal experiences. And here I don't mean yours, I mean that of the people that you're talking to, the Black Muslim students that you are interviewing and that you're studying, that you're talking to, and that they clearly recognize these as systems of marginalization, right? Like not as sort of individualized experiences. So very different from what Meena was talking about, there is a recognition that this is part of a bigger problem. And I want to sort of highlight here and lift up the fact that this analysis of oppression is knowledge production, that there is knowledge that's being produced in that process, and that you then as a scholar also participate in. But the knowledge is coming from the people who are providing the analysis. And I think that's an important sort of piece. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, the sort of like, where do we think knowledge comes from and who produces it and who gets erased from this notion of being scholars, because we have very sort of limited notions of that. And I would point out, you didn't, but I would point out that, of course, US college campuses are microcosms of larger communities and societies. And so some of the dynamics that are reflected there in a sort of somewhat exceptional 4-year period are also representations of things that are happening, and we know that, in broader Muslim communities in the US context, right? So like it's not an aberration, it's actually a reflection of a broader problem. And I really liked and appreciate that you offered a sort of longer history of the MSA. I was going to ask if you feel comfortable, you don't have to if you don't want to. I wanted to mention this letter from 1978 that's been circulating on social media from this MSA leader that I think makes that point really profoundly, that this isn't a recent problem, right? And not only that it's not a recent problem, but also that MSA leadership, at least this particular leader, that MSA leadership was very aware of these dynamics. And so that the racial exclusion and the anti-Black racism that you are describing are actually part of a historical trajectory of non-Black Muslims setting themselves apart and working in the system, right? So, I mean, I found it really shocking to read that because it's so crass in its language. And at the same time, I also think it's really instructive to realize that that language and that recognition has been around for that long, right? That this is from the beginning period of the MSA. And it does, I think the letter does contradict the sort of this claim that I now regularly see in Muslim contexts about the, colorblindness of Islam and Muslims don't see race. Clearly, at least those Muslims did at the time. And I want to point out, so one thing that I thought more about was the function and the relationship between Muslim chaplains and MSAs. So I want to point out that there are MSAs on all kinds of college campuses, but chaplains can only be at private institutions. And where they are chaplains, I find really fascinating to think more about. My colleague Sajida Jalalzai does some of that, to think about what aspect of Muslim chaplaincy is about pastoral care and what aspect of it actually invests chaplains with religious authority. So I just, and that's especially interesting to think about in relationship to MSAs, because MSAs are transient and can change dramatically. I don't know if that's what you're finding, but like from my experience just on the UNC campus, the MSA changes with generations of students. And I've been here long enough to sort of go through various iterations in terms of stands towards sexism, towards racism, towards who is involved and who isn't involved. And so a chaplain actually potentially stabilizes those trends because they can be there for longer. And at the same time, because of that transience, I think MSAs are also potentially more nimble in terms of change than the surrounding Muslim institutions and organizations, right? So like there is also a possibility here. I think I'll stop there. And I would be really excited to just hear more from both of you.
Well, I can start since I guess you kind of ended with me. And I think I want to thank you for your comments. I think you're absolutely right that the campus is a broader reflection of what's going on in the larger community. And I think that young people don't really see their value and their continuity of what they bring and what they take from the campus right into the masjid. And that they in fact do that. And the problem is that young Black Muslims see that as well. They see it because they a lot of times they're part of what's called the unmosqued community. And that's primarily why they are unmosqued. And is because what they experience on campus is what they know is what they face when they go into the masjid in the community. And it's why they remain unmosqued. So for example, I work with the Black Muslim students at Howard University. And when they're primarily for a lot of them, their only mosque experience is at Howard University because they don't come from communities where there is a majority Black Muslim mosque experience. And so when they go back home, wherever they come from all across the country, it's not a Black Muslim experience. And so they don't go to the masjid at home. So, but because it's not the same thing at Howard University, it's not a Black imam, the programming is not geared around a Black experience. So when they go back home, a lot of them are unmosqued. And what's even the problem, a lot of them are primarily unmosqued, even in the DC area, if they're in the DC area, because a lot of the masjids in the DC area are not predominantly a Black Muslim experience. And which is very troubling for me because they're like, well, where should I go? I live in this area, I live in that area. And there are not a lot of masjids that I can refer them to because they're looking for the same kind of experience they get at Howard University. 98% of our Jummahs are done by a Black imam. And so they're looking for the same kind of experience. Our programming is with the Black, experience. And so they're looking for the same thing when they graduate and they go back out into the community and they can't find it. And so a lot of them kind of remain this sort of unmosqued. And so it's a very troubling experience for them. Your other thing about the letter, the reason why I didn't mention the letter is because I just want to verify it as a primary source, just to kind of, new researchers kind of thing. I wanted to verify, but the letter was very troubling in one regard, but it just verified my research that this is what has been for the MSA from the very beginning. It was not created to work with and include Black Muslims, even though I have talked to people in the MSA National, we're inclusive, we want to work with Black Muslims, we've never been exclusive, we've always tried to include them, yes, but no. And so, you say one thing, but we see something else. And this is the letter is just revelatory. And like I said, that's the only reason why I didn't mention it, because I just wanted to get some verification. And the thing is, for chaplains, that's why I included the information at the end in terms of resources for people who are chaplains and for people who may not be chaplains. These are resources that anybody can use. If you're in student affairs, so if you are a chaplain, you can use those resources. If you're just in student affairs and you're working with Black Muslims on your campus, or you're at a public campus, invite Black Muslim, whoever, to do a programming on your campus, because you're working with these Black Muslim students. They feel alienated. They feel marginalized. They are on the outliers. They're only there for 4 years. They want to have some kind of an experience relative to their faith. And it's just really, really tragic and hard for them. They're really suffering. The things that I've heard from students, and this is really the focus of my PhD dissertation, it's just really troubling and just really very difficult for them, and they're crying for help, and there's no one there to answer. Yes.
I actually really appreciate that, Nisa, because I think it coming actually from the other end with my paper and sort of some of the work that I pulled out, my approach, and I think Dr. Hammer, you caught on to the idea that it is about the individual sort of function, role, and how they internalize. And this does come heavily from human development theory and the idea that different units of study, life course in particular, and a lot of the work that I'm looking at for my dissertation is about whether or not once all of these forces act on a person through family systems, through social structures, through the variety of interactions that come in and out, and then from there all the way out to, I think one of the more well-known ones is like the ecological systems theory, right? When we look at all of the different layers of influence on this sole individual in the middle, who then has time, space, and actions that they can take, such as stepping in or stepping out or searching for or seeking out the identity that they don't have access to, the faith practice that they don't have access to. Do they do that? How do they do that, and why? So not to negate, I would say, and this does really sort of, I think, divorce the faith aspect, particularly in the time of a growing movement. And I've seen this a lot with folks I've talked to, of the spiritual but not religious. And so if it is spiritual but not religious, but there is still a cultural embodiment of what this faith identity, because it is so enmeshed with how we are brought up in these spaces and times, is it the religious identity, or is it how an individual is then taking all of this in and then choosing to enact and live sort of their ideals out, be it through, seeking out and actually wanting to, for example, go into an MSA and actually not feel like you're an outsider in that group or an insider in that space that's pushing others out, and how that actually works. And I think more importantly to that, which is where I'm hoping my dissertation will go as I move forward, is to actually see if it's a conscious choice. Is it something that folks realize, particularly within the South Asian community, where there is more relative privilege simply by being brown, not Black, that is there actually a conscious decision made, or is it that there is such a deep enmeshment and sort of burying in this cultural epistemology that it's out of sight, out of mind? And then it goes into things like, in this context, South Asian anti-Blackness, the caste system, and other movements that have led to this constant sort of continued racialized hierarchy that's only then promoted and supported within the United States through its own racial stratification and hierarchy.
It's interesting. We were doing, our MSA at Howard was doing a program with our Catholic students. The Catholic students wanted to learn more about Islam. And we had a student from Bangladesh who was there, and he was saying that, he realized a lot of the anti-Blackness he had learned from growing up in Bangladesh. And he said he had to learn it the hard way, because coming to Howard University, and he realized that growing up in Bangladesh, and number one, it's one thing to learn and be infused with anti-Blackness, but coming to Howard University is the worst place to express that. I mean, that's like the absolute worst place. I mean, you may do that at American University or Georgetown or someplace else, but coming to Howard University to express your anti-Blackness is the absolute worst place. He said he realized that all Black people were not drug dealers, the women were not all prostitutes, and they were not all criminals, but he said he had to learn that the hard way. And he kept wondering, why are all these Black people in college? Why aren't they all in jail? And he said he realized that this is what he learned by watching the movies and watching TV in Bangladesh. And he said he was his mind was blown, but he realized this is what he had learned at home. And when he got to school, he kept like, what are you doing here? Like why are you, are your parents in jail? Like, what are you doing here? And he was so shocked that he had internalized all of this anti-Blackness. And it was such an eye opener for him. And I was just really proud of him. He was a part of our MSA, that he could, find a voice to express this and to realize that the anti-Blackness is so real, that it is a real thing, and that unless you're in a position to express it and understand it, that it comes out unconsciously. And you don't even know that you are expressing anti-Blackness until you are confronted, and people are like, whoa, dude, that's not cool. that is not cool, and do not talk to me that way, and don't treat me that way, because you're about to get a beat down. And he said he realized it time and time again, where he had to just check on himself, like, why am I acting like this to people who are showing me all kind of love and support and care, and why am I treating them like they're dirt? And he had to just check himself before he wrecked himself, because it was about to be a hard road at Howard University. It was not going to be cool. And he said his first semester there was terrible, because he had to realize he was just expressing all of this anti-Blackness, and he couldn't realize, he had to just realize, where am I getting this from? Where did I get this from? And he had to look at all the movies, all the magazines, everything that he had internalized just growing up, all this anti-Blackness, and then he had to just say it was all wrong. But it wasn't until he had to do this self-inventory that he learned this, that it had been infused with anti-Blackness. But so this is what Black Muslims encounter all the time, this anti-Blackness that they have to deal with on a regular basis, that they're just, you know what, sick and tired of dealing with. And they are now being empowered by watching the Black Lives Matter movement, all of these things, to say, you know what, enough. I'm only going to be on this campus for 4 years. I want to have fun. I want to be like other students and enjoy my time here. I don't want to have to fight anti-Blackness in the MSA. I don't want to have to do that. If I have to do that, I'll just leave. I don't want to have to eat hummus and baklava and you know, chicken biryani every time we have an event. You know what? How about some mac and cheese? How about some string beans? You know what? How about some chicken? You know what? Whatever. I don't want to have to be a facsimile of you. I have a culture of my own. You know what? How about some Thai food? You know, there are Muslims in other places. How about some Malaysian food? It doesn't just have to be that. You know, we can explore each other's culture. They don't want to be a facsimile of someone else. They want to be true to who they are. And so they just get tired and just say, I'm out of here, which is a very sad thing.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to open it up for the Q&A now to have enough time for some questions. And I'm going to hand it off to Arpan to handle moderating that part of it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that fantastic panel. I definitely got down quite a lot of notes, which I'll be looking to in the future. To begin with the questions, I think the panelists can see their questions, but I'm just going to go through them in the order that they are there. The first one was for Meena, and it came from Yasmin Floden Ali, who asked, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. It's wonderful to have you here. I'd love to hear more about how you are adopting Omi and Winant theories for your work, and if you potentially think that your work demonstrates some of the limits of their definitions of race and racialization. Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks for that question. Yes, there are definite limitations. And actually one of the, it almost becomes a position that flips towards this individual's role, because with Omi and Winant and what they really bring in as they're presenting this theory of race formation, racial formation, it is heavily focused on systems and structures. And it's also heavily focused, I mean, I believe that they use the term phenotype, like it is a body, like it is what you look like, not who you are inside. And if we think about, particular to the South Asian movement and some of Prashad's work, he starts to talk about how, you know, internally there is this sort of duality between American and Indian, and what part of the culture was shed through the good minority movement of assimilation and acculturation and other things like that, and what was actually adopted and lost over time. None of that can be captured through Omi and Winant's work. What it does do, however, is it positions that if this is in fact how the systems and structures form, we carry that forward to this idea of the lived epistemology, right? What is my way of knowing and being in the world as a result of what's imposed on me? And so racialization then, at least in the way that I hope to continue to operationalize it, and along with Omi and Winant's work, is more focused on showing the sort of the systems and positions of power, and emphasizing that there is an entire sort of force, a cultural, social force that's imposed upon an individual, whether or not they like it. Now, they can choose to not respond to it. They can choose to sort of close in. We see this in certain communities. They close in on themselves. They retain their communal values within wherever they live. There's a huge movement of that within Dallas. If I look between downtown Dallas and a little bit more towards the suburbs, depending on what communities you're in. I've also seen it in Richmond, Virginia, and a couple other places that I've been to. And so when that starts to happen, that's a response. It's a community response to these systems of race theory. And so definite limitations, but I think it allows for us to then create a sort of understanding of patterns of response, as well as then, again, going back to something Dr. Hammer, you said that, how do we use education around that, right? How do we actually revitalize the way that education is understood internally, communally, individually, to actually combat that a little bit, and let folks not be so reactive to that.
So I mean, yeah, I think this next one is also for you. It came from Dr. Zarina Grayball, who asks, thanks for this fascinating presentation. I'm a bit stuck on categorizing Black people as insiders. Is that Kim's formulation? Certainly, we can't really talk about Black Muslims as insiders. Parenthetical, R. Lawrence Moore uses them as a paradigmatic case of American religious outsiders, sorry. Close parentheses. Apologies if I misunderstood the racial triangulation framework you're applying here.
No, and Dr. Graywell, thanks for the question. And I think here with this one, you didn't, and that's actually one of the things that I pull out with this theory is a little bit more of a look at operationalizing the insider experience. And so what Kim pulls out with her triangulation is that it is ultimately to push forward. I'm using like Lipsit's term of the possessive investment in whiteness, that there is this entire structure that maintains sort of a hierarchical monopoly on maintaining superiority at the top, where the Black American can be seen as more American than the Muslim American. And that inside, in Kim's framework, it's the Asian American, that they're forever the Orient foreigner, they're forever the outsider and other, no matter what they do. And this is where Omi and Winant's work starts to come in, because there are phenotypic characteristics that maintain that divide of that foreigner. That said, what Kim also brings out is then it's ultimately to maintain the racial hierarchy, that even though Black Americans might be understood as insiders, they're forever at the bottom of this hierarchy and the stratification. And that now Asian Americans are complicit, one, in maintaining that, because they want to be accepted and valorized. They want to be given that position of authority and acceptance, because they're seeking the insider status, while conversely also recognizing that they can never actually be there. And so do they resist that? How do they resist that? And if they do, at what cost? And I think that's, to be completely fair, in the last year, we've seen a lot of that with the coalition building, particularly, with the events that have happened in the last year in this country, and coalition building across these sort of racial ethnic divides, because there is a understanding that this, I wouldn't say understanding of the triangulation, but I think understanding that, there's a sort of single hierarchical top here that's maintaining the power. And so I think, I hope that gets to a little bit of what you were sort of getting at, Dr. Graywell, and I'm happy to continue expanding on that, maybe offline.
I'm pretty sure Blacks do not feel like they're the insiders, and they definitely do not feel. Another thing to think about is that when Black people are generally talking about conversations, whatever's going on in the Black community, they're not talking about Black Muslims. Black Muslims are generally not included in that conversation. And typically when Muslims are talking about things, Black Muslims are not included in that conversation either. So Black Muslims are like in this intersection of race and religion, to where they're not included in anybody's conversation, not included in Black conversations, not included in Muslims conversations. So they're like, where do we fit in? They're just not fitting in anywhere. So they're just like, where do we go? Where do we fit in? The typical Christian is not considered a Black Muslim. A typical Muslim is not considered Black. So they're just like, where are we? We're just nowhere.
Yeah,
I want to bring in what Muhammad was talking about yesterday, right? That the category of the Black Muslim isn't singular in that way either. That various sort of configurations that Zain Abdullah has also written about of being African American and Muslim, and being African immigrant and Muslim, for several generations, and the debates that those various sort of communities of Muslims have around the question of whether they're Black or whether they're actually eventually becoming African American, who decides that. I think there are a lot more complications to that, right? And the other thing is, I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but there's also a religious hierarchy, right? There is a religious hierarchy among Muslims about authenticity. I think, Nisa, you brought out very clearly how that is configured, and that when I first came to the US 20 years ago, I sort of noted that that was happening. And when I teach undergrads, I find that they're always like, so this is still happening. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's still happening. The conversation hasn't actually changed. I do want to quickly say I attended another lecture yesterday because it's Malcolm X commemoration weekend. Professor Donna Austin gave a beautiful, beautiful lecture yesterday about the women in Malcolm X's life. And in her presentation, but also in the conversation around it, one of the things that I was struck by is, and that's something that I've thought before in looking at resources like Sapelo Square, for example. There is also a really vibrant Black Muslim life that doesn't depend on other people telling them whether they're authentic or whether they are at the bottom of a racial hierarchy, right? So I find, and actually I think, Nisa, one of the interesting things about your research is this question of, do they have to be part of the MSA?
Exactly.
Is it maybe that the MSA is not capable of representing Muslim communal life on a campus? I mean, I was at a university once upon a time where the Shia students created their own organization because the MSA was so terrifyingly Sunni-centric that they were like, okay, fine, we're gonna do our own thing. And they had a lot of fun doing their own thing because those constraints were lifted. And so I think American Muslims sometimes tend towards this, we need to be one community, because it helps us represent ourselves politically differently. But there's also something to be said for the spectrum, the diversity, the very many different ways. And Professor Austin yesterday also talked about the fact that, sort of to touch on the mosque piece, that a lot of really important work, especially work led by Black Muslim women, takes place in organizations that are not connected to the masjid landscape anymore. And of course, there are reasons for that as well.
Right. Another thing is like a different name, like at DePaul University, their student group is called UMA, specifically to not deal with the historical anti-racism that's connected to MSA. And they say on their website, we're called UMA because we welcome everybody, specifically to deal with all of these issues. They're called UMA. So the name means a lot to some students.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that now gets into sort of the value and role of how the other part of my background is in higher ed and student development. That's what I did prior. I've jumped all over. And so within that is a big piece of it, right? How do we actually create then a truly, this is an ideal, right? If we look at what colleges were meant to be built as in terms of these democratic institutions, particularly in the United States, I wouldn't go beyond that, of developing the social citizen, the active and responsible social citizen. Now, of course, it was built where sort of the ivory tower and all of the features of it are built into the walls of every institution, no matter what we do about it. But can we now create, again, going back to education, a space and a time where the way that we engage in creating a space for student development and engagement and belonging actually takes this reality of breaking apart that totalization of cultures, using Medina's words again, breaking that apart to, again, get at the nuance even of what you're sharing of that Black movement within which there's all these other communities that have their own movements and histories that erase, not erased, what's valued, what's not, and all of that. And that cultural tension that's masked by the phenotype, by the external position of race. And how do we actually divide that when we can't control what that external presentation is? And what does that resistance look like? And can we create that space on college campuses so that self-authorship is more of a choice, that there's agency to it, that there's value to it, and so on and so forth.
All right, thank you for those comments. It looks like we are out of questions, but there are a couple of comments here. One individual has mentioned, thanks Nisa for your presentation. I look forward to your paper and sharing it widely. I took notes and will make sure to share it with my local MSAs, including the ones at Stanford where I went to school. I don't remember having any programming on African-American Islam, except of course on Malcolm X. Another attendee has mentioned, Nisa, thank you for your paper. As a former MSA member, I also struggled to stay in MSA because I saw so many issues across class, caste, race, and politics. And an anonymous attendee has provided a shout out to DePaul and to Uma. So I think that should bring our panel to an end. Does anyone have any questions, comments that they would like to share further?
I do wonder if you want to take a stab at the meta questions that I asked you, or whether you just both conveniently forgot that I asked them in the first place.
I did not. I wrote it down.
Yeah, I wrote them down too.
Yeah. I think for me, there's definitely two angles. So there's I think the actual action of completing this work that is heavily focused on the individual. Now, do I believe that that's the audience of the recipient of this work? No, but I think it is a place to then establish that there is a need to do this on a communal level, that in our communal spaces, we're able to educate against anti-Blackness, that we're able to then regain by breaking apart this totalization, retracing our individual histories, claiming that, and in that claiming and sort of ownership of identity, that then it allows for us to actually act individually, outwardly, in a more conscious and willing way, as opposed to falling into that socialization that occurs so implicitly. And sometimes not so implicitly, but still accepted, because now I have to negotiate which community tie am I willing to give up for. So yes, there's value in my religious faith community. I get community benefits from it. I want to be there. It brings me safety, peace, and sort of a sense of purpose. However, in my day-to-day life, that isn't what I can live on. I need to do this in my day-to-day life because that is going to get me in trouble. And so now I'm negotiating which community tie I'm willing to keep. And how we can actually tackle that in a meaningful way so that it isn't a tension, but it is sort of a source of the ultimate sort of pluralistic understanding, if you will, right? That bringing together, and it's no longer a tension so much as a source of actual communal power.
And I think for me, I guess my prescription, I guess my audience, whom I directing this to, is to chaplains and student affairs offices, because you mentioned public institutions don't have chaplains, but they have student affairs offices. And so I think this is who would be over clubs and groups and organizations on campuses. And so I think them knowing this kind of information and knowing these kind of things are going on, it could be instructive for them, and they would be in a place to provide some kind of influence to help direct the resources and the aid to help Black Muslim students have a better experience.
Well, and as Maha was saying in her comment, like sort of eventually sharing that in some form with MSAs.
Oh, definitely.
Despite the fact that, as I said, it's rather transient. I think some of the trends that were addressed by the disgruntled students that you began with around this notion that the MSA is apolitical, which at least here at UNC has sort of taken sort of various forms. It's a really interesting, like on one level, I would argue that taking the stance that you are apolitical is a political stance, right? On another, I mean, this is true for scholars as well. It's a perpetual debate that some of us are having about whether you see your work as political. Doesn't actually determine whether it is political, but it's a political stance to say what I'm doing is not political. Mm-hmm. But there is also this sort of question, and I know UNC's MSA has had debates and struggles with that along the lines of, like, where does that put us in relation to the administration, right? Like who who polices and who regulates what types of activities are considered religious activities, which are protected in a very particular way, and when does it veer into something that's definitely not religious. But I also think, and I'm not working with the MSA for a host of reasons that are all on their end, not on mine. But I think it would be really interesting to think about what happens when MSAs connect themselves more to student organizations like the Black Caucus, to say, okay, we can be religious, but we can also do some of that representational work that other organizations on campus are very clearly doing.
Right.
And so to participate in that, right? And the MSA here has, for the most part, with the exception of a 2-year span where the MSA president was a Black Muslim, has sort of veered in the opposite direction and has sort of turned down these attempts to say, can we speak about what's happening in our society and on campus by extension as well.
Right. It's interesting. I was talking to the Muslim president, MSA president at Yale is a Black Muslim woman. And she said she was trying to talk to the MSA president at all the Ivies, trying to get them involved with the Black Lives Matter movement. And some of them were like, why would we get involved with that? Like what? And she was stunned. I mean, she was like, what are you talking about? And she, at the hesitation and the resistance, and she was like, okay, let me call somebody else. And she was just really surprised at the hesitation some of them were giving her about getting involved with that. And so it's like exactly what you're saying. Like she was like, what's going on? So yeah.
I hate to do this, but we're gonna have to close off this conversation. There's just about a minute left before this panel has to close, and yeah, so Kylie will go ahead and do the outro. Thank you so much, and I'm so sorry for cutting you off during this amazing exchange.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really, really great. We had a lot of appreciation on social media and in the chat, so that was really great. Thank you. We really appreciated the comments from the audience, Dr. Hammer's comments to the presenters, the conversation between all of you, and of course the presenters themselves. We're going to go on a 10-minute break now to grab coffee, food, anything else you'll need to do, and we hope to see you soon on the last panel called Histories of Racialization. Thanks so much.